This is CBC Late Night News.
Good evening, I'm Marivelle Tarouk. Ontario health officials say there are 4 new cases of COVID-19, 3 of them in York Region, 1 in the city of Toronto. But despite the rise in cases, officials say the risk to the public remains low. Magda Gabriel reports.
Our strategy here is containment.
York Region only confirmed its first case earlier this weekend. A woman returning from Iran with her husband and child. She was tested in hospital and has since gone into self-isolation. Now her husband is sick too.
Whilst he accompanied his wife and toddler, he didn't develop any symptoms at all until after arrival in Canada and whilst he was in isolation.
Their son has yet to be tested. Meanwhile, officials are working to determine if anyone else may have been exposed. Wednesday afternoon, the family boarded a number 40 GO bus to the Richmond Hill Centre terminal from Toronto's Pearson International Airport. The bus has since been taken off the road and disinfected.
And now today our focus is on reaching out to the actual passengers on the particular bus.
Attempts to contact those who may have shared flights with the family are also underway.
We would not be as worried about any casual contacts that may have occurred, right? But this is part and parcel of us still digging in and trying to assess the situation.
Health officials here in York Region don't want people thinking that this virus is circulating within the community. They stress the fact that all these new cases are travel related. Among the other cases, a woman in her 70s who traveled to Egypt last month, and 2 men who had separately traveled to Iran. And while they investigate, York Region health officials have a note of caution for all travelers coming back to Canada.
General advice from the federal agency is that anybody who's come from anywhere internationally should be self-monitoring themselves for signs and symptoms.
He says the main signs and symptoms you need to look out for are a fever, cough, and shortness of breath. Magda Gabriel, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, there are some who think simply monitoring for symptoms isn't enough to stop the spread of the virus. Members of Toronto's Chinese community are appealing to the government to heighten screening of travelers returning from all affected regions and to urge them to self-quarantine. Kelda Yoon reports.
I just want to say that this is a very different type of virus.
With representatives from all 3 levels of government present, the Confederation of Toronto Chinese Canadian Organizations made a public appeal to travelers returning from China and other affected regions to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. Speaking through a translator, President Wang Guoning says the situation is worse than many may realize.
There's quite a number of people returning from China. They are in self-isolation because they have gone through it and they have seen how badly affected it could be.
It's a very responsible way to fight the virus.
Han Dong, MP for Don Valley North, says while he supports the idea of self-isolation for some travelers, it's not at the point yet where it can be enforced.
If you put a mandatory quarantine in action, that means that there's tons of enforcement power and personnel will be needed on the ground to do that. Right now in Canada, the infection risk is still low.
But Gary Isaacs says he expected better screening when he was returning to Toronto from South Korea, just as the country was seeing a surge in infections.
I was quite taken back by how lack of information. There were no questions. I mean, there was not even anybody saying like, you know, do you feel like you have a temperature? Are you feeling ill? Like nothing.
Currently, only passengers from China are subject to screening, and only those who have been in Hubei province are told to quarantine themselves. Isaac says he and his wife have made their own decision to isolate themselves.
If we had all of our family over for dinner and then one of them got it, we would have felt terrible.
In GTA's Chinese community, hundreds of volunteers are supporting those who have made that decision, delivering groceries and checking in with them daily.
We actually were thinking of doing like a flyer with all that information combined, the resources available from the government and also our volunteer groups. So we're hoping that the government or the airport can also collaborate with us.
Meanwhile, Councillor Jim Karagianis says he supports the community's appeal, but also has a message for those who are not at risk.
Go out, shop, go out, spend your money, go out to the restaurant, support the local businesses.
Kelda Yoon, CBC News, Toronto.
Toronto firefighters have extinguished a fire under the Gardiner Expressway after the flames generated thick black smoke this afternoon. Emergency crews were called to the scene just after 2 p.m. The fire was on a ramp west of Yonge Street and east of Bay Street near Lakeshore Boulevard. Fire officials say they believe the fire began in a homeless encampment. At its peak, the plume of smoke shot into the sky, snaking alongside a condo building. Firefighters also put out hot spots and pulled out debris. Toronto police say a structural engineer from the city will inspect the ramp for damage. No injuries were reported. Well, if you're riding the TTC tomorrow, expect to start paying more. Fares have increased 10 cents today, with Presto fares now at $3.20 for adults and $2.25 for seniors and youth. Cash fares will go up to $2.30 for seniors and youth, but will still be $3.25 for adults. And monthly passes are also pricier, now costing $156 for adults and $128.15 for students and seniors. The TTC expects the 10-cent fare hike will generate about $31 million in revenue that will go towards improvements to the transit network. Okay, we're going to get our first look at the forecast. Christina is here for that. So you were right yesterday, another really nice day today.
Absolutely, Maribel. We are looking at some pretty mild temperatures for the week up until Thursday, but we're going to be starting off our week with some showers tomorrow morning. We're looking at 4 degrees in Toronto. I'm going to show you how we're going to get there. This low pressure system comes in Sunday overnight into our pre-dawn Monday, but it's going to hang over northern Ontario. Going to cause some flurries there, but check out what happens here in southern Ontario. This warm front comes in, this greenish area. Well, that means we're going to get some rain. This is going to go all the way up through Ottawa into Montreal. Chance of freezing rain up there, and then into Quebec. It's really a snow story. But for us here in Ontario, this is where we're going to see this rain right through the 401 corridor. Toronto, we can expect about 5 to 10 millimeters of those light showers. Our temperatures, though, for our Monday afternoon at 6 degrees. Check this out for the next 3 days. There's your precip for your Monday, but Tuesday, Wednesday, dry and seasonal, if not above, in all of the greater Toronto area cities here, including Kitchener, Burlington, Markham, and Pickering.
All right, don't mind that. Thanks, Christina. We'll see you in a bit.
Thank you.
An international mining conference at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre became the target of protesters today, shutting down Front Street for hours. We'll have the details coming up. Also ahead, the bank of candidates to become the next Democratic presidential candidate shrunk by 1 today after former Mayor Pete Buttigieg quit the race. Details straight ahead. Protesters shut down a portion of Front Street today in an effort to disrupt one of the largest mining conferences in the world. They say the industry is dated and they're calling for change. Natalie Nanowski reports.
With drums, microphones, and large signs targeting the extraction industry, a few hundred protesters packed into Simcoe Park.
Well, my day job is controlling Canadian mining companies and their operations in Latin America. I'm really sort of passionate about it because I've seen the violence and the sort of like destruction that Canadian mining means for Latin American communities abroad.
They positioned themselves right across the street from the Metro Toronto Convention Centre, where one of the world's largest mining conventions is underway. PDAC attracts about 25,000 people from 130 different countries. And as protesters spilled onto Front Street, stopping traffic for hours, conference goers came outside to watch.
Over 50 organizations have endorsed this rally and its demands that the Canadian mining industry stop colonizing Indigenous land, stop the widespread destruction of water, air, and land, and stop leading us towards a literally unlivable planet through climate crisis.
Environmental degradation wasn't the only focus.
Each name on each of the ribbons is the name of someone who's died around the world as a result of mining exploration.
Protesters were also supporting the Wet'suwet'en First Nation and the anti-pipeline blockades that took place across the country.
So we're here in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their demand that the RCMP stop invading their land to shove through a pipeline.
The protest outside of the convention center lasted until late afternoon. Natalie Nanowski, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, as mentioned in Natalie's piece, the ongoing blockades in support of Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were a big focus for these protests and the ones we've seen across the country. But after days of negotiations, Wet'suwet'en chiefs and senior government ministers say they've reached a deal. CBC's Chris O'Neill-Yates has the latest.
After 4 days of meetings, some success. A proposal recognizing the rights of Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders over their traditional territory.
That it is about the nation coming together to make sure that their traditional laws and customs and legal orders are honored.
The details aren't being shared yet.
We want to bring this back to our houses, and we're going to be working on that within the 2 weeks. That we want to see a turnaround on that.
The Wet'suwet'en Nation itself has been divided on the Coastal GasLink pipeline that's supposed to go through their territory. Most elected chiefs support it. Many hereditary chiefs, like Chief Was, don't. That still hasn't changed.
Right from the start, and I have to reiterate this again, the hereditary chiefs are opposed to any pipeline going through their territory.
The RCMP and Coastal GasLink agreed to leave the territory while talks were on. In a statement, the company says it will resume work tomorrow and it will complete the pipeline as scheduled in 2023.
A proposed agreement has been brought to the table, but it does not, unfortunately, address the Coastal GasLink pipeline directly, and it doesn't address the RCMP occupations.
Chief Was says he wants to sit down with the RCMP to discuss how the force can return peacefully. Whatever the final outcome will be, this dispute has moved the conversation about development on Indigenous lands forward, says this professor.
You will hear these hereditary chiefs saying they're not against development. They're just against tremendously irresponsible development that, gives the benefits to somebody else and all the risk to them.
Still no deal on the pipeline itself, but Chief Was calls today's agreement an important milestone. He says he wants more talks with government, the RCMP, and Coastal GasLink. Chris O'Neill-Yates, CBC News, Vancouver.
It's been nearly 2 months since Ukrainian International Flight 752 was shot down over Iran. But the devastation for the families left grieving continues. There are still many unanswered questions, like why was the plane allowed to take off at all? As Ashley Burke explains, money may be part of the answer.
They've traveled from Iran to pack up what's left of their daughter's life. Her Toronto apartment full of memories, her belongings, and her music.
Now it's hard to believe that she doesn't exist anymore.
I miss her so much. Negar Bourguet was a master's student at McGill University. She and her husband died when Iran shot down Flight 752. Her family's still haunted by why planes were allowed to fly in Iran just hours after it fired missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq.
We're asking ourselves time and time, and we're waiting for the answer.
An Iranian aviation expert says closing down the airspace would have cost Iran.
It's because of the money. Money is important. Money is important for the government.
With the rise of ISIS in neighboring countries, Iranian airspace had provided a critical safe passage for airlines to travel between Europe and Asia. To use it, Iran charges a higher fee than some other countries, often more than $1,000 Canadian per flight. With more than 800 flights a day, that's potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in daily income, about $140 million between March 2018 and 2019. After the shootdown of a Malaysian Airlines flight in 2014, Ukrainian-Canadian Michael Boserkiu was part of a special group that monitored the investigation. He said countries are often reluctant to close down airspace for economic reasons.
This is a regime that has been heavily hit by sanctions. They're very dependent on foreign currency, foreign income, which overflight fees give them. So it very well, was probably factored into that decision.
This is disgusting.
The Bourguets hope it isn't true.
Human life is beyond all that.
Airlines also need to conduct risk assessments and reroute planes if it's not safe to fly. This week, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister is meeting with the airline in Ukraine to try and speed up getting compensation for victims' families, and in a separate meeting, talking about going after Iran for compensation too. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
The man who surprised the U.S. by winning the Democratic Iowa caucus is dropping out of the nomination race. Pete Buttigieg made the announcement in South Bend, Indiana.
I will no longer seek to be the 2020 Democratic nominee for president, but I will do everything in my power to ensure that we have a new Democratic president come January.
Buttigieg said his goal from the beginning was to see Donald Trump defeated, and that the best way to accomplish that now was to suspend his campaign and help unify the Democratic Party. His early successes stalled last night when he lost badly in South Carolina. The news from the Buttigieg campaign came just 24 hours after Joe Biden's convincing win in the South Carolina primary. The CBC's Paul Hunter looks at how this weekend has reshaped the Democratic race.
Joe Biden! The comeback kid, they called him, at a church service this morning in Alabama, and in no small way, they're not far off. Last night, Joe Biden didn't just win the South Carolina primary, he won big. As Biden himself put it,
"We are very much alive."
But even as Biden celebrated his first win of the primary season, fact is, eyes are already on a bigger challenge 2 days from now, so-called Super Tuesday, when voters in fully 14 states mark their ballots for who to challenge Donald Trump for the White House this fall.
Nobody wins them all.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, branded by many Democrats as too radical for most Americans, came a distant second last night, but he's still favored to win most of the delegates up for grabs later this week. As he put it today,
I think we have an excellent chance to do well on Tuesday and to win the Democratic nomination.
Still, key to Biden's win last night, strong support from black Americans, critical for any Democrat eyeing the White House. It's a constituency yet to embrace Sanders, or, for that matter, New York billionaire Mike Bloomberg, a latecomer to this contest who spoke this morning at that same church in Alabama that had welcomed Biden. But for Bloomberg, a dramatic rebuke. Criticized for policies while mayor of New York, widely deemed racially discriminatory, today, as he spoke, parishioners stood and turned their backs on him, remaining that way throughout in silent protest. God bless you. all of it, raising the stakes for Tuesday and the potential, if Bloomberg falters, for the contest to quickly turn into, effectively, Sanders versus Biden and a race to the finish line.
All of this with word Pete Buttigieg has tonight ended his campaign for the Democratic nomination, with the presumption his supporters will now move over to Biden, a significant boost for Biden and just in time for Super Tuesday. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
Coming up, do you ever think about those 90s TV shows you love so much? Wish you got a chance to hold on to a bit of that history? Well, several people got a little taste of that at the Toy and Nostalgia Show. We'll take you there after the break. It is one of the most visited museums in the world, but today the Louvre closed its doors over concerns around the COVID-19 virus. CBC's Jelena Adzik explores how the Louvre and art institutions around the world are coping with the outbreak.
To put this in context, every day, the Louvre Museum in Paris sees around 15,000 to 30,000 visitors. That's a lot of unhappy people today, as the famous site made this announcement related to an internal meeting held with staff. An informational meeting on the public health situation linked to COVID-19 prevention measures has delayed the opening of the Louvre on Sunday, March 1st. That resulted in a long line of disgruntled patrons who ended up being locked out of the Louvre for the duration of the day. It also resulted in the sharing of this punchy meme featuring the Mona Lisa wearing a face mask. Well, the impact of the coronavirus outbreak is also being felt at Tokyo's National Museum of Western Art. It was set to soon exhibit 60 prized Van Gogh paintings, traveling for the first time outside of Europe. But now the famous sunflowers are staying in the quarantine section of the museum after Japan's Culture Ministry ordered a 2-week closure of all national art museums. And all of that follows shortly after hearing about this year's massive Hong Kong fair known as Art Basel being canceled. It doesn't bode well when you consider this famous quote from painter Gerhard Richter: "Art is the highest form of hope." Yelena Adzik, CBC News, Toronto.
Okay, we're going to one more look at our forecast. Christina is back with that. So you're basically saying all the snow that fell last week is going to be gone this week.
Well, we may still see some on the ground, but we aren't going to be experiencing any systems this week. So we are starting off our week with some showers, but we have high temperatures. Actually, we've got those high temperatures pretty much across the country. Our afternoon high will be 6 in Toronto. Let's take a little closer look at this long ranger. That low pressure system that comes in is going to hover over northern Ontario, but for southern Ontario, it's really a rain shower story for your Monday. The good news, that makes its exit Monday night. Here's where we're going to see that rain in the 401 corridor, from Windsor all the way up to Ottawa, Cornwall, and Montreal, where it really becomes more about that freezing rain and snow into Quebec. Our 7 days Toronto. Here's your precip for Monday. Clear skies Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Next system comes in, but we are looking at dry skies and mild temperatures, even above seasonal, for the next 3 days into your Thursday.
And we'll take it. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
Now, before we go, we want to tell you about an event today that drew in crowds both young and old, the Toronto Toy and Nostalgia Show.
No, that is old. That is legitimately 70s. I can tell you exactly. Oh, I can. 1977. So that is.
So who wants a 43-year-old John Travolta figure? Can you believe that? The event took place by Downsview Park. Fans showed off and traded some of the very best in new and, as you heard in that clip, vintage toys. And for some, this event brought back those childhood memories.
It brings back memories, long forgotten memories, rooting through all kinds of bins, finding toys, remembering old friends, and just bringing back all the feels like days long past.
I'm with you, all the feels indeed. And that is our show for you tonight. I want to thank you for watching. You can also stay caught up on news anytime on our website, cbcnews.ca. We're going to leave you now with a bit more from the Toy Show.